hello everyone, and welcome to this first webinar of the year by Reach Law. And today, very current topic, Ukraine Reach, because it's just entered into force. So today we're going to talk about specifically the pre-registration phase and what that means in practice. We'll also look at some other parts, but that will be the focus of today. So today we have two presenters, my colleague Olesia and myself, and I'll let Olesia introduce herself. So Olesia, please go ahead.
Yes, hello everyone. My name is Olesia Winterberg. I'm a global accounts lead and legal advisor at Reach Law. I've been with the company since 2010, and during my years with Reach Law, I have worked with a number of chemicals regulations from EU Reach, KKDAK, UK Reach, and the rest. And nowadays, I'm heavily focused on the Ukraine Reach, Ukraine CLP, and the law on chemical safety of Ukraine. And my background, I'm a lawyer and a native Ukrainian speaker, so I'm the one who can actually read this legislation in the original language. Thank you.
Thank you, Olesia. And I'm Fredrik Johansson. I'm a partner, head of sales at Reach Law. I have a long background already in chemical regulations and EHS type of regulations, and happy to be in this call. I do not, unfortunately, speak or read Ukrainian, so I'll leave that to my colleagues who do. So happy to be in this webinar together with you to discuss Ukraine Reach and the pre-registration part specifically. So looking at the agenda for today, so normally just a quick overview of Reach Law, what it is we do. Then I will hand over to Olesia to go through give an overview of the new chemical safety legislation in Ukraine. Olesia will then also talk about Ukraine Reach, give an overview thereof, and then I will go into the nitty-gritties of the registration process, or look at the registration process in general, and then focus more on the pre-registration part. So looking at how you can pre-register, options for non-Ukrainian suppliers supplying chemicals to the Ukrainian market, how they can comply, then how should I prepare for the pre-registration phase, and then we'll end up with conclusions. Actually, the action plan is there in between. Seems to be a small non-update in this agenda, but you will see it correctly in the intersections here. But nonetheless, Q&As at the end, and then of course you will find our contact details at the end. We've scheduled 60 minutes for this, but I think we will probably go over that a bit. Sorry for that in advance. Anyway, let's look at Reach Law in brief. I think most of you know us already, but repetition is the mother of all learning, so why not do it quickly again? So looking at what we do, so we provide support for Reach and Reach-like chemical regulations globally. That's our focus and core. And that is why, of course, we are now also talking about Ukraine Reach, because we have an office in Kyiv in Ukraine to be able to provide specifically these Ukraine Reach, CLP, and along chemical safety related services. We'll come back to that in the few slides. Beyond that, we also have offices besides the head office here in Helsinki. We have offices in Manchester, in Brussels, Istanbul, Turkey, Mumbai, and New Delhi, both in India and in Seoul in South Korea, to support those regulations that we have in those jurisdictions. In India, obviously, we don't have Reach, at least yet, but in all these other jurisdictions, we have so-called Reach and Reach-like chemical regulations. So the EU Reach, of course, is supported from the head office here in Helsinki, whilst in UK, from our Manchester office, Turkey, KKDAK, and SEA regulations, of course, from Istanbul, and K-Reach, K-OSHA from Seoul. Pretty self-evident, I guess. So what we do is we provide market access services for chemical substances, chemical products, and much more. So, for example, one of our core services is providing only representative services in these jurisdictions we looked. And then, of course, also doing all the technical stuff in preparing dossiers, whether they are registration dossiers, authorization, notification, whatever. We do the whole thing from the more standard services such as co-registration to the more demanding lead registration dossiers and authorization and so forth. Sorry. We also provide, of course, consultancy support services for all of these and much more, and even training. So good for you to know. If we look at specifically Ukraine REACH and Ukraine CLP and law on chemical safety related services, and you're wondering what is the law on chemical safety, Olesia will touch upon that briefly. So here, obviously, being an only representative is a very important service that we are providing through our local office in Kyiv in Ukraine. And then, of course, we do all the work that we are discussing here today in this presentation, starting with pre-registration, the actual co-registration, whether it's simplified or regular lead registration, managing the lead registration work as a lead registrant-driven project, or if they want to, or the clients want to set up a consortium. Of course, we then also work on the safety data sheets, labels, and then this toxic chemical substance permit application under this law of chemical safety, and much more, CLP notification, etc. So we do it all, is the gist of this slide, I guess. And just to toot our own horn, if that's a saying, then I'd just like to highlight that we are one of the leading only representatives globally, representing over 1,000 companies at the moment. So that is what we do. One of the core services we provide is only representation in these jurisdictions, and I'm very, very proud of it. We'll not go through all the regulations, just wanted to highlight that in this slide we can see, just give an overview of where we are with the different main chemical REACH-like chemical regulations that we are working with. So of course, Ukraine is, we'll talk about that today. UK REACH was still waiting for this alternative transitional registration model to essentially be sanctioned, put into law, so that it's officially the model going forward with the registration. So everyone's waiting for that. In Turkey, we're also waiting for these procedures and principles for KKDI implementation document, and specifies some of the practicalities related to going forward with registrations in Turkey, and that is likely coming up in the very near future, so stay tuned. EU REACH, of course, we are still waiting for the REACH review. Beyond that, of course, there are a lot of updates and qualitative updates to a lot of dossiers going on. Okay, REACH, obviously, we had a registration deadline end of last year, but the next one is at the end of 2027 for the 10 to 100 ton dossiers. So if you have those, that will be your next deadline for K-REACH. And in India, we service local customers with all these jurisdictional, these chemical regulations, then, and also support companies with this India BIS standard adherence for certain chemical products and other products to comply with the standard before they're placed on the Indian market. So that is something very, very unique to India, has nothing to do with REACH. And India REACH, as mentioned, is pending indefinitely. We'll let you know when and if that ever comes to fruition in practice. And the final copyright disclaimer. So the content in this presentation is, of course, for general information purposes only, and is not a substitute for the real consultation and professional expertise such as provided directly by REACH law. Therefore, if you take any actions based on this presentation, it's at your own responsibility and risks. So, and so forth with this disclaimer of copyright. Feel free to stop the recording whenever needed. Well, at least on YouTube to review this in more detail. Anyway, with that said, I will hand over the floor to my colleague Olesia to go through the new chemical safety legislation in Ukraine.
Thank you, Frederick. So now we will look at the chemical safety legislation in Ukraine in more detail. Next slide, please. So the change with the chemical safety legislation in Ukraine has happened a few years ago. And the change is basically motivated by the Ukraine's aspirations to become the member of the European Union and harmonize its legislation with the European Union legislation, as this is essentially also a requirement to become a member of the European Union. Next slide, please. So everything has started from the approval of the Ukrainian law on ensuring chemical safety and management of chemical products. And briefly, we refer to this law as LCS, or Law on Chemical Safety. And this is a foundational framework for chemical safety in general on the territory of Ukraine. Before this law, there was no single legislation or a separate law on this matter. Therefore, a law on chemical safety was a big step in the compliance with the chemical safety standards, and also in the alignment with the EU standards. And basically, the law on chemical safety is a prerequisite and also a reason why we have Ukraine REACH and Ukraine CLP. Both are technical regulations. They are not laws, but technical regulations. So they are layer below the law on chemical safety. And both of these regulations are more or less are copies of their EU counterparts. And of course, as from the practical perspective, the focus for the industry is the technical regulations, Ukraine REACH and Ukraine CLP. Next slide, please. So when we look at the entry into force dates of this new legislative framework, so basically the law on chemical safety was approved in 2022, and there was an 18 months of transitional period before it entered into force on the 29th of June 2024. So basically last summer it entered officially into force, and this is a law that was approved by the Ukrainian parliament, which is called Verkhovna Rada of Ukraine. Then afterwards, the technical regulation on classification, labeling and packaging of chemical products, which is Ukraine CLP, was approved on the 10th of May 2024 by the Cabinet of Ministers of Ukraine, because this is a technical regulation of the law. This is why it's approved by the Cabinet of Ministers and not the Parliament. And as most of the technical regulations in Ukraine, it had 6 months of transitional period from the approval date to the implementation date, and it officially entered into force last year on the 15th of November 2024. So it's also already in force. And then last but not least, and the focus of today, is the technical regulation on safety of chemical products, which is Ukraine REACH, technical regulation Ukraine REACH. And it was published a bit later, approved a bit later than Ukraine CLP, but in any case, it was approved on the 23rd of July 2024, and as I mentioned previously, it had also 6 months of transitional period as most of the technical regulations in Ukraine, and it officially entered into force last Sunday on the 26th of January 2025. And this presentation, we will focus on the Ukraine REACH. Next slide, please. So we have received quite many questions about the hierarchy and the supremacy of the law on chemical safety and the connection and interconnection between the technical regulations and resolutions on the approval. So we decided to explain the connection between all of these legislative acts on this one slide. Law on chemical safety is the main foundational framework. It's a law and it has absolute supremacy over all other legislative acts on the chemical safety in Ukraine. In the text of the law on chemical safety, it has quite many implementation procedures embedded in the text of the legislation. It means when there is an implementation procedure on certain requirement of the law on chemical safety, it can also be related to Ukraine REACH and Ukraine CLP. It will be highlighted in blue color and you can find a hyperlink inside the law on chemical safety. And these implementation procedures are approved by the Cabinet of Ministers of Ukraine in the same way as the technical regulations are approved in this case. So then we have the Ukraine REACH and Ukraine CLP, which are technical regulations also approved by the Cabinet of Ministers of Ukraine. However, we have to remember that to approve a technical regulation, the resolution on approval of such technical regulation has to be signed by the Cabinet of Ministers of Ukraine. And in these resolutions for both Ukraine REACH and Ukraine CLP, you have all applicable transitional periods for this or that requirement of the regulations accordingly. So for example, in the Ukraine REACH, we have the transitional periods for the registration in the text of the resolution of approval, and for CLP, it could be, for example, the new hazard classes entry into force state, so transitional periods for those. So all of this legislative framework is the new chemical safety legislation that we are going to discuss today, but of course with the focus on the Ukraine REACH. Next slide, please. The competent authority for all of those legislative acts mentioned on the previous slide is the Ministry of Environmental Protection and Natural Resources of Ukraine, which we usually refer to as the Ministry of Environment, or MEPR. And you can find the ministry website here on the slide as well. Next slide, please. So whenever you are looking into the practical application of the requirements of Ukraine REACH or Ukraine CLP, please remember that there is a law on chemical safety, and many of the requirements of the Ukraine REACH and Ukraine CLP are tightly connected with the law on chemical safety. And a good example here would be, for example, a toxic chemicals permit, which is required under the law of chemical safety, but the category of substances that are considered toxic are specified in the Ukraine REACH text. So when you read Ukraine REACH, you can find those categories specified, but the requirement for permit comes from the law on chemical safety. So there is interconnection between the Ukraine REACH and Ukraine CLP and the law on chemical safety, as you have seen on the previous slides. Therefore, don't just interpret Ukraine REACH in isolation. Please remember that there is a law on chemical safety as a layer above. And for example, the toxic chemicals permit we refer to as the mini authorization application, because the requirements are quite similar to authorization, but a bit less stringent. And we had a webinar on Ukraine law on chemical safety, so you can find it on our YouTube channel, Rich Law Talks. Therefore, if you're interested, please visit our YouTube channel and you can listen to the webinar. Next slide, please. So this was the overview of the chemical safety legislation in Ukraine, and now let's go into the overview of the Ukraine REACH. Next slide, please. So as said, Ukraine REACH is already in force, officially entered into force on the 26th of January 2025. It's a technical regulation that has 673 pages. It has 295 articles, 8 sections. In comparison to EU REACH, it has 15 titles, and it has 18 annexes. In comparison to the EU REACH, 17 annexes. The legal text can be found here on this via this link, and we have received again quite many questions about the official translation of the regulation in English, and unfortunately no, there is no English translation, official or unofficial, of the regulation, and likely there won't be any official translation of this regulation in the English language. Next slide, please. So as said, Ukraine REACH has almost exactly the same amount of annexes, the same 17 annexes. However, there is an additional Annex 18, which is the correspondence table, which explains the comparison between the EU REACH articles and the Ukraine REACH articles. Next slide, please. So here you can see the actual example of the Annex 18 correspondence table. So on the right side, you could see the Ukraine-rich provisions, and on the left side, EU-rich article. So you can compare article by article. However, the annexes, for example, are not comparing articles by articles, just annex by annex. So that's a little bit more difficult to see what are the differences, if any, in the annexes. Next slide, please. If we talk about the differences between Ukraine-rich and EU-rich in general, the first category of differences would be, of course, the different terminology and contextual adjustments. For example, in Ukraine, for obvious reasons, there is no community or the European Economic Area or member states, and therefore those were removed from the text of the Ukraine-rich. Also, there is a little bit difference in the regulatory processes, and those were also adjusted in the Ukraine-rich text. Another category of differences would be unique provisions that are unique for Ukraine-rich. And here the main thing is the category of toxic substances. This is defined in the Article 259 of Ukraine-rich that defines the specific categories of toxic substances. And those substances require a separate permit that is specified in the law of chemical safety. And it's important to remember that this toxic chemicals permit is an additional requirement in addition to the registration, and there is no threshold for toxic chemical substances. So, for example, if you place toxic chemicals on Ukrainian market in less than 1 ton per year, it means you don't have to register under the Ukraine-rich, but you still need to have the toxic chemicals permit in place according to the law on chemical safety. Then we have another unique provision, which is a simplified registration mechanism. And this is specified in Articles 26, 27 of Ukraine-rich, and my colleague Frederick will go in more details about the simplified registration and is it actually simplified or not under the Ukraine-rich at the moment. So all in all, Ukraine-rich is more or less a copy of the EU-rich. However, it was adapted towards the national regulatory requirement, however, still maintain the EU-rich framework and the essence of the regulation as such. Next slide, please. So for the industry, the main implications of Ukraine-rich would be, of course, that you need to pre-register and register substances if they are placed in 1 ton or more per year, unless specifically exempted. And this is relevant for Ukrainian manufacturers, Ukrainian importers, and the only representatives of the non-Ukrainian manufacturers and formulators. And in addition to registration and pre-registration, we of course have other processes under REACH in the same way as they were applicable under the EU REACH, and in Ukraine we also have evaluation, authorization, and restriction. And the no data, no market article has been also transposed into the Ukraine REACH, meaning that you need to generate or acquire data from the data owners to use it in your registration dossier, for example. Next slide, please. So in this webinar, I would like to emphasize that we will mostly focus on the pre-registration because this is a precursor to registration and also other processes under the Ukraine REACH. Next slide, please. And to summarize the differences and the similarities between the Ukraine REACH and the EU REACH, let's look at those one by one. So the only representation is, of course, possible under both of these regulations. And under the Ukraine REACH, it seems that no approval from the authority will be also will be required for the approval of the only representation. However, the final process, whether the authority will be collecting the only representative appointment documentation or not, is yet to be determined. The pre-registration, it was possible under the EU REACH, however, no longer possible because all the deadlines have passed already. For Ukraine REACH, yes, its pre-registration is currently ongoing. I mean, it's not yet operationally possible and to be discussed by Frederick, but the officially and legally the registration has started from the 26th of January 2025, and it's applicable to all substances that are placed on the market in 1 ton or more per year, and it will be possible to late pre-register. And the difference is that the full compositional information will be required for the pre-registration, which is very likely, and again, more details will be provided in the practical part by Frederick. So we have the requirement of the registration exactly in the same way as in the EU REACH. The polymer registration, polymers are exempted, but not the monomers. And we all know that in the REACH review, this could change for the polymers, and likely also it will be then harmonized in Ukraine. There are exemptions from the registration in both regulations, more or less the same. The registration data requirements basically the same. More volume, more data is required. However, in Ukraine we have the simplified registration, but the implications in terms of the data are yet to be determined, and at the moment it seems that with the current interpretation, it will be the same data requirements, unfortunately. We have a concept of joint registration in both of these regulations. We do have R&D exemptions. There is no product notification as such in either of these regulations. We do have the difference in terms of toxic substances. There is no such category under the EU REACH, however, a separate category for such substances under the Ukraine REACH, and the permit for the substances, as previously explained, without this threshold is required under law on chemical safety. We do have the safety data sheet requirements in both of these regulations. However, no SDS certification in either of these. For example, as it's different in the KKDK, where the SDS certification is required. And also, as in KKDK, there is a dossier review by a certified person. There is no such thing under the EU REACH, and no such thing under the Ukraine REACH either. Next slide, please. So this was it, and over to you, Frederick.
Thank you, Olesia. Okay, I will save you from my face, so I'll just have my camera turned off. So anyway, now let's look at the Ukraine REACH registration process. This section looks at the whole process per se, and then we have separate sections for looking at specifically the pre-registration requirements, etc. And rest assured, we will be providing a new second webinar, another webinar, which will then focus more specifically on the registration part. So I will go through this fairly briskly because I think most of you know this already. But nonetheless, again, repetition is the mother of all learning. So we'll do a quick recap and give you an overview of the registration process. So Olesia already mentioned that this is a copy, more or less, of the EU REACH regulation, and that also means that they've copied essentially the same scope, meaning that all substances, unless they're specifically exempt from the scope of the Ukraine REACH regulation, will need to comply with the regulation. Specifically, there are also other exemptions. For example, they are within the scope of the regulation, but they are specifically exempt from the registration requirement. So all in all, the same as under EU REACH. So I would say, like, if we think of it from a percentage perspective, 99%, 98%, maybe more of all substances would be subject to Ukraine REACH and even Ukraine REACH registration. So if we look at the registration process, again, it is the same as under EU REACH. So all substances that manufactured in Ukraine and imported into Ukraine as such or as part of mixtures at 1 ton or more annually must be then first, of course, pre-registered and then registered by the applicable registration deadlines, pre-registration and registration deadlines. We'll look at that in the coming slides. The registration tonnage bands, Aloysia mentioned this already, but the data requirements increase by tonnage bands. So we had 1 to 10, 10 to 100, 100 to 1,000, and over 1,000 tons tonnage bands, whereby the higher the tonnage band, the more information you need to provide as part of your joint submission. So essentially, the lead registrant provides more information. Co-registrants, not so much. It's the requirement on data for these different tonnage bands lies with the lead dossier, in the lead dossier. Registration types are the same, so most of you will be registering as a full substance, but in some cases, if you are in Ukraine and you're manufacturing something that is intended to be turned into another substance, then that could be an intermediate substance, and if it's under strictly controlled conditions, then you are eligible for reduced data requirements. And the same applies for transported isolated intermediates, albeit that these can originate also from outside of Ukraine. To be eligible for reduced data requirements, you must, of course, apply with the definition and then the strictly controlled conditions throughout the whole supply chain. If we look at the timeline, so indeed, Ukraine Reach entered into force on Sunday this last week, so just a couple of days ago when recording this webinar, having this webinar. So today we are here at the dawn of the pre-registration phase. It will run for 12 months until 26th of January next year. So in this window, most of you will be pre-registering your substances for the Ukrainian market. Late pre-registration is possible for first-time manufacturers and importers after the deadline. We'll come back to that. After that, we have the first registration deadline already, 1st of October 26, so next year. So this timeline is very short for the high tonnage band CMR substances and these very toxic to aquatic organism substances at 100 tons or more. Then we have the second registration deadline is 1st of June 2028 for 100 to 1,000 tons, and then for the smaller tonnage bands, it's all the way 1st of March 2030. But for those astute listeners, viewers, you can see that these deadlines are slightly ahead of those in the UK and in Turkey. So actually, with this timeline, Ukraine will beat the other ones to the line of having their substances registered first, if that is somehow a contest. Nevertheless, interesting. Joint submission concept applies. So what that means is you have one lead registrant who submits the lead registration dossier containing the core registration data, so the physical, chemical, toxicological, ecotoxicological information. It can also include the CSR where applicable. And then you have 0 to many co-registrants, all taking part in this joint submission. And then, of course, the registration dossier is eventually, as well as the pre-registration dossier, is submitted to this Ministry of Environmental Protection and Natural Resources of Ukraine. We'll just call it MEPR in this presentation. Also, as it's a copy, it's possible to do opt-outs, but that requires special cases, which we will not look at here. So if we look at the process going from pre-registration to registration, then if you manufacture in or import into Ukraine a substance at 1 ton or more that is not exempt from the regulation as a whole or exempt just from the registration requirement, and you do this on a legal entity basis, meaning the tonnage band is calculated per manufacturer, per importer, then what you need to do is you need to pre-register by the applicable deadline, which is 26th of January next year. So just a few days shy of a year from now. After that, once you've pre-registered, you will become a member of a pre-CIF, so Substance Information Exchange Forum is the CIF acronym there. This constitutes the pre-registration process, which will be a focus in this webinar. Then you will need to go from there, select the lead registrant, agree on the substance identity, Then you form essentially a SIF, a substance information exchange for including all the potential registrants, early registrants in some cases, data holders even, and then eventually you will, of course, register as part of a joint submission whereby the lead first submits the lead dossier and then the co-registrants submit their registration dossiers after that. And this constitutes the registration process. And as said, we will have more detailed webinars going through this process later on. But today we'll focus on this, albeit I will touch a bit more on this because we got so many questions on the simplified registration process, so I have to slightly open it up. Anyway, we'll look at the pre-registration process in later slides. Now let's just have a quick look at the overall registration workflow. Already alluded to this in the previous slide, but just wanted to give a bit more granularity for those of you who are interested. So again, you are the manufacturer, importer, or you could be the only representative for a substance that is at 1 ton or more placed on the Ukrainian market. You do the pre-registration and become a member of the SIF, you pre-SIF and then eventually a SIF. You select the lead registrant. This can be in the other way around, but here it's this way. Then you will set up SIF agreement, which defines the rules of the cooperation for the members of the same SIF registering the same substance. Then you will go to the data sharing data gap analysis part, whereby you see what data is available, what do you need, where are the gaps, what else do I have to do to fill those gaps. You do that by data access negotiations, usually and data collection, because all the information is available from EU REACH, for example, because as mentioned, Ukraine REACH is a copy of the EU REACH regulation and the data requirements are the same. So then lead prepares the dossier, submits the dossier to the ministry. Then you can do the letter of access calculations. You can do it simultaneously, but in this workflow, it's afterwards. Then you issue letter of accesses to the co-registrants. Then the co-registrants purchase these letter of accesses, sign, of course, the appropriate agreement, prepare the dossiers, co-registration dossiers, submit them to the ministry, and then you are done from a joint submission perspective, except that, of course, you need to keep things up to date, as is also a requirement under EU REACH, for example. So who is the lead registrant? Well, it's the company who takes upon itself the responsibility in the SIF to then manage the whole and coordinate the work for the purpose of jointly registering the substance. They clarify the substance identity and then collect the data and assemble it into a dossier and a CSR where needed for over 10 ton per year substances. Then they also take care of the sharing the costs fairly transparently and non-discriminatorily, selling these letter of accesses, and of course then managing the whole thing and preparing and submitting the joint registration dossier to ministry in good time so that all the other ones can register ahead of the applicable registration deadline. And here you can already see that the first deadline of 1st of October next year for these higher tonnage band substances and the nastier ones is quite short. So we'll see how that pans out. And of course, keep things up to date and keep records. And on the co-registrant side, yeah, it's you have the responsibility of course, to cooperate in this SIF and then agree on the substance identity coordinated by the lead, share data, share costs by purchasing a letter of access, and then of course, compiling your own co-registration dossier and submitting it to the ministry before these applicable registration deadlines. Either you do it then yourself if you're an importer or manufacturer in Ukraine, or you do it through your only representative that you have appointed for Ukraine REACH purposes. And an only representative can also be a lead registrant, of course, as per the previous slides. And then keeping things up to date and records is very important. So let's look at this simplified registration a bit, because we got a lot of questions on this. So indeed, Ukraine Articles 26 and 27 define this simplified registration applicable for EU REACH registered substances. So what that means is in practice is that if you as an EU REACH registrant, so either a manufacturer, importer, or you could be a non-EU manufacturer formulator who's appointed an only representative in the EU to register, can benefit from this simplified registration according to this the provisions in Ukraine REACH. This mechanism, we know the data requirements, we'll look at that separately, but some of these data access related things are a bit obscure at the moment, remain a bit unclear. So there are a lot of question marks still on this simplified registration process. And these will be determined as time goes by, and hopefully by the next webinar, when we delve into these registration things related, registration processes, lead and co-registration in more detail, we will have more information on this. But if we look at what is contained in this simplified registration, so this simplified registration is typically submitted then by your only representative. If there are, of course, Ukrainian manufacturers who have appointed an only representative in the EU, then those can also benefit from this. But I would say the majority of the cases where this applies is where a company can appoint an only representative for the purposes of Ukraine REACH compliance. And now some of you astute listeners are looking, but hey, there was if you registered as an importer, you cannot appoint an OR in Ukraine, and that is true. But in many cases, there might be that you're importing a substance, you're registering, and you're including that in a formulation. And in that case, if you are formulating, then you can appoint an only representative. We'll come back to that in a few slides. I'm going a bit ahead of myself. Coming back to this slide, so what is included, what is required as part of the simplified registration? So technical dossier in IUCLID format, so use IUCLID to prepare registration dossiers under Ukraine REACH. It contains, of course, information about the registrant, so they know who is registering. In this case, it would be the only representative. If in most cases, I would say substance ID information, obviously, information about volumes, production processes, description of the intended uses and uses advised against, classification and labeling information, waste handling information, and study summaries and robust study summaries used to cover these data requirements and any pending testing proposals you may have out still. And therefore, 1 to 10 ton substances, just use and exposure information, because in these cases, you would not have to submit a chemical safety report, which is also a requirement. So for those who have this chemical safety report, so it needs to be included in this technical dossier, annexed under section 13, and then submitted where that is available. And then you also need to provide a confirmation of the EU REACH registration. Now we interpret this as attaching, for example, the decision letter that you received from ECHA, showing that you have indeed registered, EU REACH registered your substance, and it provides the registration number. But indeed, if you look at this requirements here, it is much more information to be included in the dossier than just a mere co-registration. So you could see this almost as a mini lead, albeit this information is of course available. So currently it is a bit unclear, will this actually, the whole simplified registration, be adopted at all? We'll see, but for all intents and purposes, one of the benefits with this simplified registration process, as you will see in a couple of slides, is that you will be subject to lower registration fees to the authorities. In any case, of course, we are following the developments closely, so the best way for you to keep track of things is just to follow us on LinkedIn, and of course subscribe to our newsletter, and of course you will find content also on YouTube on our REACH Law Talks YouTube channel. Now coming back to the general registration, applicable registration deadlines for all these registrations, whether they're simplified or regular. So we looked at these deadlines, but just wanted to highlight it here still that the first registration deadline is already next year, 1st of October, for these high tonnage banned substances over 1,000 tons and CMR substances from 1 ton or more up. And then these substances are very toxic to aquatic organisms, whether acute or chronic, at 100 tons or more per year will need to register by 1st of October 2026. So this will be quite tight in practice. So we'll see how that functions in practical terms. So, albeit all information is available, so it should not be that big of an issue, but it just takes time to organize into joint submissions, select leads, and so forth. But as mentioned, that's a subject for another webinar. Then for the lesser tonnage bands, 1st of June for 100 to 1,000, and then 1 to 10, 10 to 100 is 1st of March 2030. So indeed, when I talk about substances, I do mean substances as such or substances as part of mixtures. So we look at the authority registration fees, and also if you're looking at the clock, you will see that we will go over time, as alluded to. Anyway, the registration fees are calculated quite differently, if you will, in under Ukraine REACH. So in this case, you have certain criteria that you multiply against the subsistence minimum and of course number of substances. But let's say if you have just one substance that you're registering as a large company, that you have simplified, you're eligible for simplified registration, then you would take the subsistence minimum, which is 3,028 hryvnia, and all Ukrainians, I'm sorry for butchering this the name. Anyway, in 2025, it's around now, it's 3,028, and that equates to approximately 70 euros as of exchange rates as of yesterday. So what you do is you take the subsistence minimum times tonnage band coefficient. So for example, if it's over 100,000, 1,000 tons, you take 50 times. If it was simplified, you take that times 0.5. It's a full substance, you take that then times 2, and then you take that times 1 because you are a large company. You can see here if you're a smaller, medium-sized, or micro, then your coefficients will be smaller, and total sum will be less. So what this equates to is, for example, in my case, when I said it would be a full substance at over 1,000 tons as a simplified registration by a large company, then that fee would be here. It would be 151,400 hryvnia, equaling around 3,460 euros. But then if you are doing it as a regular registration, not simplified, then it's twice that. So it's already around a bit less than 7,000. So you can see that these authority fees can be quite steep for the industry, albeit of course much less so than what we have for under EU REACH or UK at the moment. UK will have lesser fees coming shortly, but anyway, compared with EU, much of course more lenient fees. However, if you're a small company, medium-sized, small, micro, then of course the cost will be significantly reduced. But I would say most companies will reside more or less in these brackets. So these fees will apply to you when you register for Ukraine REACH, either as a manufacturer in Ukraine, importer in Ukraine, or through your only representative. Anyway, we're following the developments of Ukraine REACH, the registration process very closely. And again, just feel free to follow us on LinkedIn and subscribe to our newsletter to keep up. And as said, we will have a separate webinar on registration more specifically as more information becomes available. So now let's look at the pre-registration part. So how do you pre-register under Ukraine REACH? All of the discussions until now have been building the foundation to understand why we are pre-registering. So the requirement to pre-register is in the Ukrainian REACH text in articles 140 to 46, where it says essentially that all substances that are subject to Ukraine REACH registration will also have to first be pre-registered when placed on the Ukrainian market upon entry into force of Ukraine REACH, which has already happened. So the deadline is, as mentioned, 26th of January next year. So we have this 1 year phase during which we will need to pre-register these substances that are eligible for registration and you have been placing already on the Ukrainian market now before now, for example, when Ukraine REACH entered into force. So in some cases, it is possible to do late pre-registration for first time placing a substance on the Ukrainian market after the pre-registration deadline, so 26th of January 2026. You can then submit the late pre-registration within 6 months of the first date of the first time manufacture or import of this chemical substance. So, for example, if you start exporting 27th of January, you will have 6 months to submit your late pre-registration. So by summer, July or so, you will have to have your substance pre-registered, albeit we of course recommend pre-registering as soon as possible, also in the late pre-registration situations. So now that we know that we have to pre-register the substances we are aiming to register under Ukraine REACH, then the question goes, what information is required as part of this pre-registration? You will of course need to provide information about yourself. I'll come back to that, but the most important and what will take most time is actually providing information about the chemical substance that you are going to pre-register. So this means provide identification information such as the CAS number or other known identifiers. This would be, for example, the EC number or list number. You need to provide the name, UPAC, trade names, abbreviations, etc. Molecular structural formula information. And what is the biggest deal in this slide is that you will actually have to also provide full compositional information on the substance as part of this this pre-registration. So concentration, purities, impurities, additives, etc. So quite a lot of information, and I have a separate slide on that. We'll come back to that in the next slide. So I'll go a bit more into detail on this part. So that is something that is quite unique to Ukraine at the moment. And why it's like that is because it says so in the regulation. So the ministry is aware that this may be a bit of a challenge, or not a challenge per se, because most companies, at least if you're EU registered, you have this information available, but it requires more work. But as it's in the regulation, it is also implemented in the data requirements for pre-registration. Besides, of course, these chemical or substance identifiers, you of course need to provide information on who is pre-registering, so details, contact details of the manufacturer, importer, or the only representative, such as REACH Law Ukraine. But you also need to provide for company details, so who has appointed you, and related contact details. You also need to provide information about the expected registration deadline, annual production and volume information that you are producing, importing, covering as an OR. Likely this will be in tonnage band brackets, not the actual annual production rates. This is what we have, for example, for EU REACH, we had for KKD, IK, etc. But then also, as those of you who were involved with the EU REACH pre-registration back in the day, you also remember that it was possible to provide information about similar substances for the purpose of the chemical agency being able to understand perhaps what other substances could be used for QSAR read-across purposes later on when the registration dossiers are compiled. So this is the information that is required as part of the pre-registration application, and this full compositional information is, I would say, what will take most of the time when compiling a pre-registration dossier or this file. We'll come back to that in a second. So indeed, this full compositional information, this answers a few questions that were received as part of registering for this webinar. So indeed, Article 141 of Ukraine REACH explains that this information, what information is included in the pre-registration application, and indeed in this paragraph 1 of this article, it says that it has to include the identification of the substance according to these paragraphs 2.3.4 of Annex 6 of the Ukraine REACH regulation. So what this means is that in this paragraph 2.3, which is part of this scope of the annex, we see the compositional information requirements specified. So degree of purity, identification of impurities, including isomers, byproducts, and then for UVCB substances, you need to provide information about the constituents also, and then concentrations of main components, groups of components, and impurities, and expressed in percentages in this descending order, and then identifiers and concentrations of additives, and again expressed in percentages in descending order. So this is the legal reference, and this part is translated freely here. So it says that indeed identifiers of the chemical substances according to this paragraph 2 to 2.3.4 of Annex 6 of this technical regulation, including the CAS number and other known identifiers. So indeed, full compositional information needs to be provided as part of the pre-registration when submitting this pre-registration application. And now you're asking yourself, well, how do I submit a pre-registration application? Don't worry, we have it covered here. And this is, of course, based on current information, but they will provide a template to be populated with information that you have collected on the side. So you need to, of course, collect the information based on the requirements in the previous slide, and then download and populate the provided Excel template. This template is not yet available, but should be fairly soon, within a couple of weeks maybe, because essentially industry should be able to pre-register already. Then the likely submission process is that you take this populated Excel template, including all your pre-registrations, attach it to an email, send it to a dedicated email address. They'll probably get, once you sent it, you probably get some sort of an automated reply saying that, yes, we have received it. And at least according to the legal text, you should then also be issued with pre-registration number within 3 days. So likely there will be some sort of a reply with said number of pre-registrations, or however they do that remains to be determined. But as you can see, if you submit these Excel files, there needs to be some sort of a mechanism at the other end being able to disseminate these Excel files into some sort of a database and issue these pre-registration numbers and somehow automate it so that you can, they will receive, for example, an email with pre-registration numbers per pre-registered substance by return email, or however they will do this. A bit of speculation here. That's what the law says. And at some point, the ministry will then publish on their website information about the pre-registered substances and the pre-registrant so that the CEIFs can be formed. I will talk about this a bit more in a coming slide. But this is the process. Very manual. For those of you doing notifications under UK REACH, this is quite a similar process, albeit different data requirements. So indeed, this template, we haven't seen it yet. It will be available soon. so we expect it within a couple of weeks. And when we have it, of course, we will keep you appraised on these additional details. So indeed, once they've issued this pre-registration number, it should be included in the communication with downstream users as proof of compliance until the substance has then been registered and received a proper registration number. So this is a bit different from EU REACH, for example, where it was not a requirement to share pre-registration numbers. Many did, but that was not a requirement. Under Ukraine REACH, it is stipulated in this regulation that you should distribute this pre-registration number to your downstream users if you have any. For example, an OR, an only representative, will share this pre-registration number, for example, as part of compliance certificates to importers that they're covering for their non-Ukrainian manufacturers or formulators as clients. Anyway, if you're looking for guidance or support documents, help desk or anything, that's not available yet. So we don't have much like practical information available. It trickles in from here and there, and but rest assured we will follow this in detail, and of course there will be guidance likely coming forth later on, as soon as possible, hopefully, especially for covering pre-registration and CLP notification, which is not the subject of this webinar. Anyway, as said, Ukraine REACH registrations have already started. Technically, you should, from a legal perspective, be able to submit, but you can't because the process for submitting is not there yet, but it will be soon. Therefore, the deadline is what we all are aiming for, to have all our substances pre-registered in due time, good time before this applicable pre-registration deadline. So, and as with the other processes, of course, REACH law is following this the pre-registration submission process in detail. And once more information is available, of course, you will be the first ones to know if you are following us on LinkedIn and subscribing to our newsletter, which I think you are because you have received this invitation to this webinar. If you are not, just go to our reachlaw.fi website and you will be able to find at the bottom of the page where to subscribe for this newsletter and thus be covered. Okay, let's look at some options for non-Ukrainian suppliers. I've alluded to this a bit, and indeed we are going over time, already 5 minutes, but for those of you who are here, still thank you very much. Those of you who have to leave, you will find the recording on YouTube, obviously, in a week's time or so. But for those who are here, kudos to you. Thank you for sticking around. A few more slides, and then we are done and end with a Q&A. So if we look at the just a summary of the responsibilities for Ukraine under Ukraine REACH for these different actors. So of course, if you are outside of Ukraine, you do not have any Ukraine REACH, and Ukraine in general does not have jurisdiction over you if you are outside of Ukraine. But if you are a manufacturer or a formulator outside of Ukraine, you can appoint an only representative to take care of these Ukraine REACH responsibilities, starting with the pre-registration, which is the focus here. So in this section, we'll look at this only representative appointment. So this is one of the 3 roles who can actually comply with the requirements according to Ukraine REACH. The other one is, of course, a Ukrainian manufacturer, if you're based in Ukraine, or a company importing chemical substances into Ukraine, being based obviously in Ukraine. And in this case, an only representative can be appointed by a non-Ukrainian manufacturer or formulator, and this only representative also have to be in Ukraine, based in Ukraine, and that's why we have our office in Kyiv in Ukraine. So indeed, your options are for chemicals that are imported into Ukraine. You can of course have if you have a local entity in Ukraine, you can then have this one take care of importer obligations, or you can have Just your customers, of course, take care of it, but I'm pretty sure they would not in Ukraine take care of it, which would make them as importers and probably not very happy. The other option is if you are a manufacturer, non-Ukrainian manufacturer or formulator, then you can appoint an Ukraine reach only representative to take care of these importer obligations, so meaning this pre-registration, registration, etc. Or you can have a combination of both. But here we'll look at this only representation option in the next slides. So indeed, as with EU reach, UK reach, Turkey KKD, IK, K reach, also Ukraine reach has this this only representative concept. It's the same as under EU reach and Turkey reach, for example, and UK reach for that matter. So it is possible, as mentioned, that non-Ukrainian manufacturers or formulators can appoint this only representative to take care of these Ukraine reach importer obligations. So what that means is pre-registration, registration, including, of course, the simplified registration, PPOR notification, inquiry, authorization, later on, even the toxic chemical substance permit under the law of chemical safety. That's a different law, but still wanted to include it here. The only representative must be based in and a resident in Ukraine. So what that means is you have to have a natural legal personality, meaning in this case a legal entity in Ukraine to be able to provide and offer only representative services. And that's why, as mentioned, we do have Ukraine, Reach Law Ukraine in Kyiv in Ukraine. Besides that, it's not just setting up any shop or having anyone be the OR, they also have to have sufficient background in the practical handling of substances and the information related to them. So, and this is in the legal text. So you must have competence, you have to have the proper procedures, tools to be able to maintain and take care of these Ukraine reach compliances. And other skills, of course, to manage this compliance on a day-to-day basis. So if we look at the benefits of having an OR versus the importer configuration, meaning that you are outside of Ukraine, you are a manufacturer or formulator, you have not appointed an only representative. So what that means is that if you exceed the 1 ton threshold per customer, then what that means is that each of these customers receiving your substance would need to individually comply with the Ukraine reach requirements, starting with the pre-registration and later on registration. So it's three times the effort if this substance is per importer at 1 ton or more. On top of that, they need to do the CLP notification, etc. We'll not talk about it here. So it's 3 times the effort, probably not very happy chaps being the importers if they have to do all of this. Instead of just having your importers deal with it, your customers, you could appoint an only representative that centrally takes care of these importer obligations. So they take care of Ukraine reach importer obligations, meaning pre-registration, registration, etc., on behalf of all these customers in Ukraine that you have identified. So what this means is that this OR does the registration, pre-registration once, the registration once for the aggregated volume of all these customers and covers them through their own pre-registration and later on registration, so that these are seen as downstream users, not importers, and they do not have to pre-register or register themselves. So you can get by with one registration, you can cover as many direct customers in Ukraine as you want, and the benefit here is that you can still supply directly to these customers. They don't have to go through this OR. It is enough that the only representative knows who these are, so that they can cover them in their management of these importer obligations. So collect volume information annually, and of course identify these companies. So very efficient way of maintaining compliance using an OR, which I think most of you already know. And an added benefit is that using an only representative also makes it possible for you to protect the confidentiality of substances as part of your mixtures to some degree. Some substances in part of your mixtures always have to be declared on the safety data sheet, but if they're not, these can be declared confidential so that your customers will not be privy to the full recipe of your formulation, your mixture. And this is very important to many companies. So using an OR also makes it possible to safeguard this confidentiality information. Because if you don't, obviously, if you are letting the importers do the regulatory duties of pre-registering and registering, they need to know the full composition. Otherwise, they can't comply. So this is where you lose your confidentiality. Whilst here, it is retained through the only representative. Only representative is not disclosing full compositional information to the customers. Very important. And how do you appoint an OR? Well, first you need to identify one. Look no further. Reach Law Ukraine is an only representative. We're happy to become your only representative if you don't have one or if you want to change. It is possible to change always. How to appoint, then we draw up the needed agreements, appointment letter, and of course including information on what substances will be covered by this appointment. Then sign these appointment letters and the related agreements, and then you have appointed your only representative. And as Olesia mentioned, at the moment, we do not know, do we need to provide additional, like provide the appointment letters or some other forms to the ministry? Probably not, but if that is needed, then that would also be part of this only representative work. But if you recall, this appointing company outside of Ukraine as a manufacturer or formulator, appointing the OR, also needs to be identified in this pre-registration file. So they already have that information. So maybe they don't need actually any additional details. So once that is done, you have done the administrative work, then the only representative can start the work by, for example, at Reach Law, setting up the required accounts for volume collecting, etc., substance identities, inventories, etc., to then perform the actual compliance work, starting with the pre-registration. However, if you are in the unfortunate situation that you don't have a local entity in Ukraine as a function as an importer, you don't have customers, or I mean, you have customers in Ukraine, I'll come back to that, but you are not a formulator or a manufacturer outside of Ukraine. So what that means is that you cannot appoint yourself an only representative. So you cannot use any of these options 1, 2, or 3. So what that means is that you could be a trader, distributor, etc., but you're not seen as a formulator or manufacturer outside of Ukraine. Then what you can do is seek supply chain coverage, check with your upstream suppliers. Have they appointed an only representative? Can you get coverage under that appointment? If they have not, you can ask, will you please appoint an only representative to cover my import into Ukraine? And you can always feel free to recommend Reach Law to them. Happy to help, of course, in this situation. The other option is it possible for you to become a formulator? Probably not, but we've seen cases where someone has actually become a formulator, opening the door for appointing an only representative. Then, if neither of these are possible, we have a special setup, which can help in some cases. But for that, I will not spill the beans here. I will ask you to contact Reach Law for details. So because it's very unique and very something that we've come up with. So please contact us for details on this situation. But if none of these are possible, then of course default is just having then your downstream users, your importers, your customers in Ukraine to do the regulatory requirements, so pre-register and register. But in this case, of course, they need to know the full composition of the substance, and they will hold the regulatory assets, because holding the regulatory assets as an importer means that they can import the same substance from anywhere, not just you. Whilst if you have an OR, then they are more fixed to your supply than elsewhere. They're more married, if you will, to the supply chain through you, because the other option is that they try to find another supplier that has also an OR in Ukraine. So if you have your customers as importers take care of regulatory requirements, be aware that you have to provide full compositional information. They can import the substance from anyone, not just you, and confidentiality is lost, obviously. And of course, they're probably not very happy that they have to do it themselves. So here, for these three options, confidentiality is protected, and the fourth one, which is the least favorable, you are losing CBI protection. So just be aware. Okay, so how should I prepare for pre-registration? So you need to determine, of course, the substance portfolio for Ukraine market. You saw the slide of what are the pre-registration data requirements. You can start collecting that already. Follow the developments. Again, as mentioned, following us, for example, seeing when, for example, the templates will be available. If you don't have resources, then seek out expert help, such as REACH Law, for example. We're happy to help you with the Ukraine REACH compliance. If you are non-Ukrainian manufacturer formulator, absolutely appoint an only representative and do this in good time. This is your best option for maintaining control, safeguarding CBI, and making your customers happy. And then, of course, start collecting the information for Ukraine pre-registration. We talked about this already. So you can take this from, for example, the full compositional information. You can take this from your current EU REACH registrations if you have some, because those are already detailed there. Or if, for example, if you've done UK REACH registrations or NRESs or inquiries, you can do that. You can take the information from there. And start preparing for the registration phase, especially the first registration deadline, 1st of October 2026 next year. That's coming up really quickly. So just be sure to budget, understand that there will be costs, allocate resources, and collect the relevant information. Use external resources where need be. Okay, so final slide, just one slide before I hand over to Olesia for conclusions, and then we cover some Q&As. And again, apologies for going over time. As per usual, for those of you who know me and our webinars. So anyway, so what happens once a substance has been pre-registered? So what's next? So in the regulation, it actually says that within 30 days from the pre-registration deadline, so 26th of January 2026. So 30 days after that, the ministry will publish a list of pre-registered substances, then also including pre-registrant contact details, so company information and contact details for the purpose of building these pre-sieves and later on sieves. So meaning they are making it possible for industry to connect and start working together for those companies who are aiming to register the same substance and work together in these sieves. And this sieve building is not, you don't require an IT system for that. The authorities do not have to provide an IT system for that. It is the responsibility of the industry to self-organize. The only thing you will need, and we as an industry need, is to know who else has pre-registered the same substances. And from there forward, we can then go ahead and select the lead, define the substance identity, become a sieve, and start the actual registration work. In the EU and in in Turkey, for example, we had the fortune of having an IT system where you can see who else has pre-registered and stuff like that. But even that work, all the practical communication was handled outside of this platform or these platforms in the form of email communications using email lists of the companies who have pre-registered the same substance. So this is important to understand. It does not require an IT system. It is responsibility of the industry to self-organize for the purpose of the joint solution. And after this, of course, the next steps would be then also talked about this already, when select the lead registrant, and then you have to notify the ministry when the CIF has been established and provide lead registrant details and who else are part of the CIF, and then start with the joint solution work. But that will be a subject for another webinar. So stay tuned for that. And with that, I'll just hand over to Olesia for the conclusions.
Thank you, Frederick. Next slide, please. So to conclude our session today, maybe the main takeaways would be that the law on chemical safety is now in effect from the 29th of June 2024. And this is the basic framework for both Ukraine REACH and Ukraine CLP. And these are technical regulations, and both Ukraine REACH and CLP are already in force. So we have the full set of the new chemical safety legislation in Ukraine in full force at the moment. The competent authority for this chemical regulatory safety is Ministry of Environmental Protection and Natural Resources. So it is responsible for Ukraine REACH, Ukraine CLP, and the law on chemical safety. In terms of Ukraine REACH, the main takeaways here is that the pre-registration phase has already started. As said during this session, it's not technically and operationally possible, but legally it has already started, and it will last for 1 year for the chemicals that have been on the market, on the Ukrainian market, before the entry into force of the Ukraine REACH. Then it's important to take benefit of the pre-registration and pre-register on time, make use of this transitional period to be qualified for the transitional registration deadlines, which should be the industry focus for at the moment. And the registration deadlines are 1st of October 2026, 1st of June 2028, and 1st of March 2030. And it depends on the tonnage band of the substance and the hazard class. For the non-Ukrainian manufacturers and formulators, if you want to comply with the Ukraine REACH and CLP and the law on chemical safety, you can use an only representative, a company that is resident in Ukraine and has sufficient knowledge of handling the chemical substances. And the only representative can take care of the importer obligations under the Ukraine REACH, so you can cover by, let's say, one registration or later registration, all of your importers. That will become downstream users under the Ukraine REACH by this setup. And of course, it's important to follow the developments of the Ukraine REACH and related chemical legislation closely. And if you are subscribed to REACH Law newsletter and our webinars, then of course you will find out the latest updates from us, because we are closely following all the developments of the Ukraine REACH, Ukraine CLP, and the law on chemical safety. Thank you very much, and we can move to the Q&A session.
All right, thank you, Olesia. So quite a lot of questions. Many of the questions you sent, or several, let's put it this way, were already covered in the presentation, but I'll just pick a few here and there because we're so much over time already. So I'll start with the first one, because this seems to be a question we get quite a lot also. Do fertilizers registered for sale need raw materials to be registered according to Ukraine REACH? Are there any exemptions for fertilizers? Do you want to take this, Olesia?
Yes, sure. So most of the fertilizers require registration under the Ukraine REACH, and this is exactly in the same way as you have to comply with the requirements of the EU REACH for the fertilizers. So if fertilizer is a mixture, so the substances part of this mixture are subject to pre-registration and later registration. They are placed on the Ukrainian market in 1 ton or more per year. And in addition, of course, if this is a hazardous mixture, you would need a safety data sheet for the classified fertilizers.
Thank you. Thank you, Lesia. And next one, this we get a lot. Will there be an official English translation of the regulation available? You already answered this, but please reiterate. So Lesia, go ahead.
No, there won't be an English translation of the Ukrainian REACH regulation and other chemicals legislations, because the national and the only national language in Ukraine is currently Ukrainian. Therefore, all the legislation and technical regulations, so all normative legislative acts are and will be in Ukrainian only for the time being.
Yes. Thank you. And then I think this is the same person who was also asking the same question in the chat. So we import products that contain the same substance that are manufactured by 2 different suppliers. Should we look at the volumes separately or sum it up? I can take this quickly. Lesia, feel free to elaborate. I assume you are an importer in Ukraine. If this is the case, and you're getting it from outside of the Ukraine, then of course, if it's the same substance, then you aggregate the volumes, and that will be your volume for pre-registration and registration when it comes to the same substance. Then of course it depends if you're outside of the Ukraine and so forth. I don't know, do you want to elaborate further on this, Olesia?
Well, I think you have covered it, but we will also send the Q&A document, and there will be details there on the different setups. So I think it's fine.
Indeed. Okay, let's take quickly number 4. Would it be sufficient if our partner in Ukraine pre-registers the substance at tonnage bands without them knowing the formulations? I think I covered this in the presentation, but if you, Olesia, want to quickly run through this.
Yes, I think you have covered it quite nicely, and it will be also covered in our Q&A document in more detail. But I mean, if you are worried about the confidential business information, of course, the best way is to appoint an only representative. Then you don't have to worry about the confidential business information. But if you still want to go with your partner as an importer, for example, please remember that you would still need to provide the tonnage information for each substance in your formulation. You don't have to provide the recipe as such, the percentages, but still the tonnages. And in the end, the pre-registration is a prerequisite for the registration. And then when you register, you have to provide quite a lot of information, and some of it could be confidential to your company. Therefore, I mean, if there is a real confidentiality issue, then just use an OR, and then you can submit all of your required information safely to the authorities.
Very good, thank you. I think the timeline, future schedule has been adequately covered here. I can add some additional details in the Q&A document, but you see it in the slides. Maybe to add on the Annex 40 substances, those will enter into force once martial law is lifted. So that's a bit of a curiosity, but for registration purposes, pre-registration, the timeline is as you saw in this presentation.
Yes, Frederick, a bit add on this martial law thing. Why is it applicable to Annex 14? It's because this martial law situation is specifically mentioned for the Annex 14 substances in the law on chemical safety, not in the Ukraine REACH as such. So this is not applicable to toxic chemicals permit, but it is applicable to the Annex 14 substances permit, which is the authorization if we translate into the EU REACH language. Thank you.
Very good. And then can a subsidiary or peer company branch be an only representative? So yes, but as mentioned, that they will need to have the know-how, capacity to actually be able to take care of these only representative obligations, as discussed in the slides. So yes, they can, but they need to have these minimum requirements filled, as we discussed in the previous slides. I think we talked also about the simplified registration versus regular registration. Then there was we did not quite what is behind permit notation. That was maybe a reference to the long chemical safety. Do you want to quickly note on that, Olesia?
Yes, so a toxic chemicals permit is a separate and additional requirement for the registration. So it's not instead of registration, it's an additional thing. So if your substance meets the criteria for toxicity that is specified in, was it Article 259 of Ukraine REACH, if I remember correctly, there are 3 categories of toxic substances. And unlike the registration, which applies to substances of 1 ton or more per year, the toxic chemicals permit doesn't have that threshold. So you would need it if for any tonnage band. So remember, this is an additional thing to the registration, and if you meet the criteria, you will need to have a permit. It's either you through the only representative here, non-Ukrainian manufacturer or formulator, or it's your importer or even a downstream user, and the permit is applied per specific use. But we have a lot of information on this in our law on chemical safety webinar that is in our YouTube channel. So if you want to know more, either just request more information from either me or Frederick, or then just listen to our YouTube recording of the law on chemical safety webinar. Thank you.
Very good. Now we'll have to jump over a few questions because time is of the essence here. Just wanted to say, I mentioned also about this, can appointed representative be changed at any time? So yes, it is possible to do OR change. So you're not stuck with them forever. So that's good. I'll pick just this number 11 here. As said, we will tackle these other questions in the Q&A document, but I'll shoot this off to you. Given the current war, how much uncertainty is there in timing of the Ukraine REACH implementation? Will EU REACH dossiers be accepted? Olesia, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I think we have a similar question later on, so I will answer to this and the similar one that we have later on in this Q&A. So basically, yes, there is a war currently in Ukraine, but still the ambitions of Ukraine to become the member of the European Union, they have not disappeared anywhere, and they are still in full force. And as you know, implementation of REACH regulation and general chemical safety legislation is actually a prerequisite to become a member of the European Union. Therefore, it's in the whatever plan that Ukraine has with the European Union on the harmonization and approximation of the legislation between Ukraine and the EU. And in terms of timing of the implementation, as you can see, everything is currently going as it was planned. So the law on chemical safety was planned to enter into force, and it did on time. There were a few postponements with the approval of both Ukraine REACH and CLP, but in terms of implementation, they both were implemented exactly after the 6 months from the approval. So as it is written in the relevant legislation on implementation. So everything is going as planned. And as far as we understand, the authorities are not planning to postpone the registration deadlines either. So something to be further clarified, but this is currently how it is planned. We have received quite many questions about if it makes sense for Ukraine to have Ukraine REACH because they want to become the EU member, then there will be the EU REACH. It's a good question, but as you know, Turkey, for example, is also planning to become the EU member, and they are actually even closer to this in terms of the processes in the EU approximation of the legislation. They are, for example, they hold this IPA status, which is the instrument for the pre-accession assistance. So basically, they get help from the European Union to implement certain applicable legislation and harmonize their legislation with the EU. And as you know, in Turkey, the KKDAK has been implemented in full force. So it means that, I mean, for Ukraine, if they want to proceed further, they will have to stick with their agenda and implementation of both Ukraine Reach and Ukraine CLP. So will the EU Reach dossiers be accepted? Well, you will be able to use the data from your EU Reach dossiers if you have the rights to do so for other regulations. And this is, of course, the question of the data sharing and acquisition of the data rights. However, the dossiers that we will be submitting under the Ukraine Reach will be also the Euclid format. So quite a lot of data you will be able to use, provided you have the rights for this data to be submitted for the Ukraine Reach, or then you have to buy these rights via the letter of access process, as is currently possible for Turkey KKDAK, for example. So all in all, yes, there is the war, but the implementation of the EU legislation is there is a plan for it, and Ukraine Reach regulation and the related legislation are part of this plan, and it will likely be implemented on time without significant postponement. Sorry for the long response, but
that's good. You covered several other questions in the same one, so I'll just shoot a few quick ones, then we conclude. Our imports to Ukraine are currently low. Should we pre-register? I would say that if you see a trend that you will exceed the 1 ton threshold, the trend is clear, I would go ahead and pre-register just in case. You can always pre-register just in case. It does not cost anything. That's answering another question, and it does not obligate you to register. That answers yet another question in the chat. Final questions, quick. Olesia, you already answered some of these, so I'll just pick this US. Will Ukraine require US suppliers manufacturers to do any additional requirements for registration compliance beyond EU Reach? We'll cover this already, but if you want to give just a short answer.
Yes, of course. I mean, if you want to comply with the Ukraine Reach requirements through the only representative, then yes, you can appoint the only representative in Ukraine and comply with the requirements of the Ukraine Reach. And you need to remember that if you are compliant with the EU Reach, it doesn't mean that this is directly transposed to the Ukrainian legislation. Ukraine Reach is a separate piece of legislation on the national level in Ukraine. Therefore, it's just a separate Reach-like regulation that you have to comply with, either through an only representative in Ukraine, or then use your importers to cover your imports. So it depends on the setup that you want to go for. But as we have recommended many times in this presentation, for the non-Ukrainian manufacturers and formulators, the best way is, of course, to comply through the only representative for the reason of preserving the confidential business information, and also to cover the importers, so we don't have multiple registration, but we have one registration by the only representative covering multiple importers. Thank you.
Very good. And last question, are plant protection products co-formulant subject to the registration if hazardous or exempt? Olesia, go ahead.
Yes, so plant protection products, the active substances are out, but the co-formulants are basically substances that are part of the final mixture of the plant protection product, and they are subject to the pre-registration and registration if placed on the Ukrainian market in 1 ton or more per year. So this is the general rule that applies also under the EU Reach, and it's in the same way applicable under the Ukraine Reach. So the same logic, also for biocides, if we have questions on those in the chat.
No biocides that I can see. Anyway, I'll take just a quick, I think we've answered most of these. There was a question, can chemicals be placed on the market regardless before the pre-registration deadline? So yes, you can, except if it's this substance is subject to this permit. That's another topic, but if we just look at from a Ukraine Reach perspective, then yes. Then there was a question, I think this question was asked before I went through it, about some portal for pre-registration. There's no portal, it's just sending by email. So we'll look at that. And there were some questions on more specifically on the registration part. We'll cover that in more detail in the next webinar. So I'll just conclude it here. There are so many questions, and we'll try to, as said, we'll compile this Q&A document and just share it with everyone who is attending or was attending this webinar. Anyway, please feel free to reach out to REACH-Law for support for Ukraine REACH or any of these CLP law and chemical safety and for only representative services. We're happy to help to provide a quotation. Contact details, you can find them on our website, of course. Here they are. Also take a screenshot. Easier probably just to go on our website, you'll find it there. And then, of course, thank you very much, Olesia, for your contribution. And of course, the biggest thanks goes to you people out there for listening to us and for hanging through all to the end. And sorry for going over time. Thank you very much for your attention, and let us know if we can help you with the Ukraine REACH and more. Happy to help. Anyway, I wish you all a great day, and thank you and goodbye.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.